I'm going to talk to you today about an amazing tree called the whitebark pine. And my fascination with this tree began a couple of years ago, climbing in the Tetons, hiking to the Gros-Ventre, driving over Togety Pass, when I realized that all the pine trees with spreading canopies were dead or dying, and that this was happening all over the ecosystem. What I learned is that pine beetles are taking advantage of warmer temperatures to infest and wipe out these forests, these high alpine forests that have always been protected by cold temperatures. And what I've also come to understand is that the greatest old-growth, unlogged forest in the American Rockies has been decimated by this silent forest fire, which its effects go far beyond the Yellowstone fires of '88. But before I depress you any further, I want to talk to you about this tree and its shape and how it relates to this bird, the Clark's nutcracker. The nutcracker plant the whitebark. They pull the seeds out of the cones in the treetops, and then they go down, they fly around, and they deposit them in the forest floor, and they go back and reclaim them in the winter. And the ones that they don't reclaim, those are the ones that turn into whitebark. The trees have actually evolved to put their cones at the ends of the branches and to lift up their branches to the sky to proclaim and profure this bounty to the birds as they fly overhead. This mutualism, this grand avian gardening project, is crucial to Greater Yellowstone because the whitebark are the protective roof of the Rockies, and besides feeding nutcrackers, they feed squirrels and they feed bears, including the grizzly bear. In fact, the grizzlies have become so dependent on these seeds out of these trees that with the removal of whitebark, I fear for their future. But I don't want to fear. I'd rather fight. And I was inspired by the ecologists at Greater Teton National Park, who are themselves fighting for the whitebark by putting pouches of pheromones on these trees. And these pheromones, basically, they transmit a chemical signal which tricks the beetles into thinking that these trees are already occupied. So it occurred to me that if we could get volunteers to go out and put pouches on these trees, that we could both protect whitebark and we could raise the profile of this issue. And it worked. In 2010, in the summer of 2010, we got more than 100 people out and we protected 600 trees. And when we went back to those trees to check on them this spring, I could find only 5 that had been infested by beetles, which was promising, although there are any number of reasons that could have been the case. But it was worth it to go back this year, and we brought even more people into the forest, and we ended up protecting 1,000 trees, which, of course, is a drop in the bucket compared to the forest of the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, but it's a start. And I believe that if you can protect any one tree, it's worth it. Because the more time I spend in the whitebark, the more it seems that there's something magical about these trees. The whitebark live at the highest elevations, in the coldest temperatures, the harshest winds, and the thinnest soils, and yet they produce the best food in the forest. And an individual whitebark will produce cones for longer than 1,000 years, and they'll do it growing out of rocks. I also feel like these whitebark are trying to tell us something. In fact, I actually believe that these trees are screaming at us. When the whitebark gets infested by beetles, its needles turn from green to yellow to orange to red over the course of the next year. It's this gruesome transformation, and they end up looking like giant fireballs, or maybe giant stop signs, as if they're choosing the color of their own demise to be that which most alarms humans. And I think it should alarm us, because what the trees are saying to us is that what befalls them is going to befall us. What has happened, this epidemic is actually not a surprise. It was actually predicted 30 years ago by a friend of mine, Dr. Jesse Logan. What Jesse figured out in the 80s was that as temperatures rise, so does beetle activity. It's perfectly correspondent, right? So he predicted that this was going to happen, that this great epidemic. And as he likes to say, the only things he got wrong are that this happened a lot faster and to a far greater scale than he could have imagined. Now, when you understand that pine beetles are actually just an agent of temperature, then you also understand that these ecosystems are actually just a gigantic thermometer. And in the warmest ranges in this ecosystem, like the Gravelies and the Madisons and the Gros Ventres, the whitebark are toast. They've been virtually wiped out. In the cooler ranges, for instance, the Wind Rivers, the Tetons, the Beartooth, there are still pockets of healthy whitebark. But I fear for their future as well. Because as we just saw in the papers this week, in the next half century, the temperatures in Yellowstone are expected to reach the temperatures that are in present-day Southern California, which of course begs the question of what's going to happen to Southern California in a half century. But more importantly to our discussion, what this means is that trees cannot, unlike wildlife, they can't move to adapt to climate change. So they die instead. And this, of course, isn't just limited to the whitebark, right? Because in the past few years, for the first time in recorded history, pine beetles have been found to be infesting the jack pine in northern Canada's boreal forests, which are truly the lungs of the earth. So I ask you, what is going to happen to those forests in half a century or in 20 years? This is an unprecedented problem for our society, but I do believe that we have unprecedented tools. Besides protecting trees and replanting them, TreeFight is pledged to build the tools with which we can better measure the changes to these forests, to these great terrestrial thermometers. And this is where you come in, because you can help us. You can use these tools with us, and you can fight alongside us. The whitebark are telling us that the mercury is rising, and it's coming for us. But together, if we can better monitor the approach of that red line, maybe we'll find increased motivation to slow it down. Thank you.